Welcome to Forum at 360, Southeast Alaska by the Numbers. I'm your host, Lisa Fu. On this Forum at 360, we're going to answer the question, what makes Southeast Alaska tick? We'll explore key drivers to the region's economy and see how it compares to the rest of the state. To help us do this, we have Meilani Schijvens, Raincoast Data Director. She's presenting on behalf of Southeast Conference, the region's economic development organization. This is their annual snapshot at Southeast Alaska's economy. Help me welcome Meilani Schijvens.
Thank you so much, and it's my privilege to present to you Southeast Conference's annual report on the regional economy. Now, for those of you who don't know, Southeast Conference is the regional economic organization for Southeast Alaska, and it started as a group of people in 1958 who sort of grouped together because they were concerned about the regional transportation system, or the lack thereof, and they worked together to create the Alaska Marine Highway System, and after that they stayed together to continue to focus on economic issues that were essential to the region as a whole. And so now there's 185 member organizations of Southeast Conference that represent 1,200 members across the region. And one of the many services they do is to provide economic information to the region, about the region, and for the rest of Alaska as well. And so that's what we're doing here tonight. Now, just to set the stage, let's talk about what Southeast Alaska is. Southeast Alaska is this sort of marvelous place. From Yakutat to Metlakatla, we are 500 miles long. And between that, we are made up of islands and more than 1,000, we're made up of mainland and more than 1,000 islands. If you measure every nook and cranny of our coast, we have over 18,500 miles of saltwater shoreline in Southeast Alaska. There are 34 communities in our region, and we represent about 10% of Alaska's economy overall. We're 10% of the population, 11% of all jobs, and 10% of all wages. And if you look at us in terms of land mass, we're about 5% of the total land mass of Alaska as a whole. But to better understand where we are now, let's go back in time just a little bit. Until the 1990s, the population of Southeast Alaska enjoyed nearly a century of growth that just intensified after statehood. During that period, the population and employment of Southeast Alaska more than doubled as workforce expanded into the areas of mining, government, fishing, tourism, and timber. And the growth of Southeast Alaska looked a lot like the growth of the state as a whole. However, in the 1990s, that all came crashing down. From 1991 through 2007, Southeast Alaska endured a sustained economic decline. So of course, the question you're on the edge of your seat asking right now is what happened? At the beginning of the 1990s, 1/5 of Southeast Alaska's economy was fish and timber. In 1991, Southeast Alaska boasted more than 3,500 timber industry jobs. But all the pulp mills and large sawmills in the region closed, laying off thousands of workers. And then these losses were exacerbated by the fact that salmon values plummeted. 3,200 timber jobs were lost. Population in Southeast Alaska dropped by 5%, and regional population outside of Juneau went down even more, dropping by 9% of the population outside of Juneau. And at this point, our economy really stopped looking like the rest of Alaska. Alaska's population took off in the meantime, growing by 20% during that period, while leaving Southeast Alaska in the dust while we grew smaller. It would be 16 years before the adverse economic consequences of the timber industry crash finally worked its way through our economy. And 2007 finally marked the last year of that decline. From 2008 to 2012, we were back on track, and this rise was nothing short of exhilarating. The Alaska and Southeast Alaska economies have always had a sort of counter-cyclical relationship with the national economy. So while the national economy stumbled, the sheer size of our government workforce and oil resources acted as a stabilizer. And during that period, our job market became an attractive lure for young people out of work in the lower 48, and our population expanded. But unfortunately, it appears that we seem to have found the top of this upward cycle, at least for now. Starting in 2013, our economy began to level out. So during this presentation, I want to talk about our 1-year and 5-year economic trends. If we look at changes in our economy over the last 5 years, it really looks fantastic. Over the last 5 years, we've added 2,600 people and 1,500 jobs to the Southeast Alaska economy. Total workforce earnings increased by $275 million, and most of that came from the private sector. With the exception of government, nearly every sector flourished. New jobs and investments occurred in the areas of seafood, tourism, mining, construction, healthcare, maritime, and energy. Housing starts tripled, and even government didn't look so bad as Coast Guard employment balanced out losses in other areas. In the past 5 years, we have broken records, reaching all-time highs in terms of population, workers, and total workforce earnings. And when we look at changes in the last 5 years in Alaska, we see that we were sort of, in the last 5 years, we were back on track looking like the rest of Alaska. The state as a whole grew almost by the same rates during the last 5 years. Population of the state also grew by 4%, 25,000 people. The labor force grew by 4%, and that was 13,500 jobs, and job earnings increased by 15%, meaning that $2.4 billion in wages were paid, additional wages were paid across the state in 2014 compared to 2010, 2.4 billion more. But as you saw in the previous graph, in Southeast Alaska, most of our expansion occurred at the start of that last 5-year period. And if we look at the data from the last year only, we actually see economic contraction. In the last year, there were few areas of growth in Southeast Alaska, and many indicators trended slightly downwards. Our population declined by 30, not very much, but still a decline. Jobs fell by about 300, still a small percentage of our total jobs. There were fewer cruise and ferry visitors to the region. The value of seafood harvested in the region fell by more than $100 million. The price of gold fell by 10%. And it doesn't look like most of these numbers are going to improve anytime soon. Early 2015 reports show more losses on the way. In the first 9 months of the year, we've lost about another 400 jobs in Southeast Alaska. Our earnings grew by 1.6% last year, but that's the same growth that we saw in the Consumer Price Index, meaning that actually employment earnings were flat. And going back to the state as a whole, again, the trends seem pretty similar. Alaska lost 60 people last year in terms of population. Not much, so it doesn't seem like a very big deal. That's a decrease of less than 1/100 of 1%. But this actually is quite significant because this marks the first time that the state as a whole has lost population since 1988. So in 26 years, it's actually the first time that we've lost population at all. Our total statewide workforce was up slightly, totaling 1,400 jobs, and total workforce earnings were up by $645 million. So those are the high-level trends, the 1-year and 5-year trends. So let's look at the specifics. Starting with our people. Since 2012, the number of people in the region has remained stable, hovering around 74,300 people. However, we have had some dramatic demographic shifts when looking at the past 5 years as a whole. Significant population growth of 12% or higher was experienced by some of our smallest communities, including Cake, Thorn Bay, Gustavus, Kasan, Port Protection, and Whale Pass. Among communities with over 1,000 residents, Juneau was the biggest grower. We added 1,700 new residents in Juneau, a growth of 6%. Our residents in Southeast Alaska and the growth that you saw inside of Juneau was really people coming from outside Alaska to grow our ranks and not from neighboring communities as we've seen in the past, so that's a change too. But not all places saw growth, unfortunately. Places with double-digit percentage losses included Hollis, Klukwan, Pelican, Port Alexander, and Elfin Cove. The most pronounced shift was the continued explosion of baby boomers into their older years. Those aged 65 to 80 grew by 34% across the region, nearly 2,000 people. The average age in Southeast Alaska is just shy of 40, and that's 5 years older than the rest of the state, or as for the state as a whole. The average age in Southeast Alaska is older than that of Florida, and we're actually on track to surpass Florida in terms of total seniors as a percent of our total population. And this is actually in spite of the fact that Alaska as a whole has the lowest population of its percentage of its population age 65 and older among the 50 states. The Alaska Department of Labor projects that in the next couple of years, that a quarter of our Southeast population will be 60 or older in the next couple of years, which translates to 1/3 of our adult population. There is another demographic that is worth noting. Our millennials, those in their teens to their early 30s, also sometimes called Gen Y, are now nearly equal to baby boomers in terms of volume. Or maybe what is more notable is the fact that our millennials are still smaller than our baby boomers altogether. If you look at the state as a whole, millennials outnumber boomers on a statewide level by far, with millennials now comprising nearly 1/3 of the statewide population, while our baby boomers represent about 1/4. Now on to jobs and wages. Last year, there was 46,000 annual average jobs in the region, and those workers earned $2.2 billion last year. A quick caveat, so by jobs, when I say jobs, I mean average annual jobs. So that's jobs measured each month of the year divided by 12. So if you have a job that lasts just 3 months in the summer, that's going to count as 1/4 of a job when you look at the year as a whole. So this pie includes all workforce earnings. So it includes our self-employed, our local commercial fishermen, our active duty Coast Guard, and it makes it really easy to kind of quickly see how our economy is distributed in terms of workforce earnings. So knowing this, how do we compare back to the state as a whole? Well, when we look at our top 3 drivers, government, seafood, and the visitor industry, we are significantly more dominant. They are significantly more dominant in our economy than they are in the state as a whole. When looking at earnings, 1/3 of our economy is government, compared to about 1/4 in Alaska overall. Seafood is nearly 3 times more significant in Southeast Alaska as a percentage of our economy than compared to the state as a whole. And our visitor industry is about 50% larger. For those of you up north, you might notice that our 3-legged stool looks a lot different here in Southeast Alaska than the state as a whole. We really have no oil and gas industry employment to speak of. And when you're looking at Alaska, this represents about 1/10 of all employment earnings on the statewide level. But I want to go back to the main pie chart of our economy. So let's use this as a map and take these pie slices one by one, starting with government. Now, government wages make up about 35% of all regional employment earnings and 30% of our region's jobs. In terms of importance to our total economy, state government has the largest impact at 14%, followed by local government, and then federal, and then the smallest is the tribal government. Last year, we lost more than 100 government jobs, mostly federal, and these federal losses are really just part of a larger ongoing trend. Since 2004, federal jobs, and for the purpose of this slide, I'm excluding active duty Coast Guard, federal jobs fell by 570 jobs altogether. And these were not little jobs. Federal government jobs pay, on average, about 3 times that of a visitor industry job. And so assuming that these jobs still existed, they would have paid $46 million into the economy in wages just last year. So what is happening? The Forest Service is responsible for about 2/3 of these job losses. Once the region's top federal employer, it has really fallen dramatically. But speaking of the Coast Guard, one sector is working really hard to fill that void. With nearly 800 jobs, the Coast Guard is now our largest federal employer by far, representing more than 1/3 of all federal jobs in the region, and it's seen considerable growth over the past 5 years. But let's be honest, when it comes to looking at how the government is going to impact our economy in the immediate term, it's not really the Coast Guard and the federal side of things that we're really focused on right now. The most concerning signal to our economy right now is the strength of our state government. Providing 1/7 of our direct wages and acting as a major client to many of our local businesses, its health is critical to our overall economic health, and as we know, the health of our state government is not well at this time. Oil revenues have historically accounted for 90% of the state's unrestricted revenues. But oil prices have declined from nearly $100 a barrel in 2014 to just half of that in 2015. And while you might look at inflation-adjusted oil prices in the past in a chart such as this one and think that maybe it's not all so bad, we've been through low oil prices before, we can survive this. The fact is that these price decreases are exacerbated by dropping oil production that has dropped 75% since peak levels and is still dropping. We are producing 34,000 fewer barrels per day now than we did last year, and those losses have translated into a $7.7 billion state deficit over the next 2 years. There are approximately 2 years left in savings at the state to preserve key government services and key projects. And so the question is, how are we going to plug this gap, and what is that going to mean to us here in Southeast Alaska? Maybe our other resources can save us. So if our other resources were going to plug this gap, gold would have to be $10,000 per ounce, salmon would have to be $50 a pound, and all tourists would have to pay a $5,000 per person head tax. This was at Fun Scott Goldsmith analysis. And so clearly that's not going to happen, and something else is going to need to be done to fix our deficit. And many of those options, increased taxes, changes to our PFD, job cuts, reduced appropriations on the state level, will result in a downward drag on our economy. So right now there's just a lot of uncertainty as to what these changes are going to be and what the result of the economic impact is going to be on our economy and our jobs and our industries and our people overall. So now for the second major pie slice. Southeast Alaska has several dozen fisheries conducted mostly by a fleet of small boats. Nearly the size of state government in terms of earnings, the seafood industry is our largest private sector employer in Southeast Alaska in terms of wages, accounting for about 12% of all regional wages and 10% of all jobs here in Southeast Alaska. Total seafood jobs were up by 400 in the past year. So looking at this graphic, the outer ring represents the harvest by dollar value, while the inner pie represents total pounds landed, so it represents volume. And our salmon species in Southeast Alaska represented about 4/5 of overall regional seafood catch in terms of volume last year, but they actually only accounted for just over half of our total seafood value. But if you look at other species, like really high value species like halibut, black cod, and crab, altogether, they represented just 7% of our total value, but they accounted for they accounted for 7% of our total volume, but they accounted disproportionately for 1/3 of the total value of the Alaska's seafood last year. And if you were wondering where king salmon comes from, it comes from right here in Southeast Alaska. Last year, 9 out of 10 king salmon caught in Alaska came from Southeast Alaska. And 1/3 of all salmon comes from Southeast Alaska waters. And yet, we actually look really different from the state as a whole when you look at the total fishery. Ground fish make up the majority of the value and the total volume of harvest for the seafood harvest overall for the state of Alaska. And so we don't really have any of that to speak of, so we do look really different. So what you see here is a chart that tracks total pounds of seafood landed in the region and compares it to the total value of the catch. And that relationship changes clearly a lot year over year. The catch value for 2014 was more than $100 million less than 2013's catch. And this year's catch, 2015, is a tricky one. Pink and coho came in far lower than expected, and on top of that, the prices this year are really depressingly low. Salmon is unfortunately not $50 a pound. If you average it out across species, it's about 49 cents a pound right now. And these rock bottom prices have yielded out the lowest payments to fishermen since 2006, with salmon prices about 33% on average lower than they were last year. So if you're depressed by all of my slides so far, I wanted to bring you up. There's some good news. If you need some good news, look no further than the visitor industry. We added more than 200 new tourism jobs to the region last year and more than 1,000 tourism jobs since 2010. The visitor industry accounts for 15% of all jobs in the region, and 9% of all workforce earnings. So it's really a big deal here. There's nearly 2 million air, ferry, and cruise passenger arrivals to the region in 2014, and that's an 8% increase over 5 years ago. 1/3 of all Alaska spending by tourists occurs right here in Southeast Alaska. Last year, visitors spent $591 million in Southeast Alaska. And McDowell Group just informed us that new estimates for the 2015 cruise season are out. We think that we got 994,000 cruise passengers that came to Southeast Alaska this year. And the estimates for next year, what we think is going to happen next year, is 1,013,000 passengers expected for 2016. Other cruise news, Yakutat welcomed its first cruise ship ever this year, with more visits planned in the years ahead. And both statewide and both across the state and in the region, we can expect a new cruise passenger record to happen in 2018. Speaking of records, we're actually also closing in on a new record for air passenger arrivals. Airline passenger arrivals peaked in 2007, but 2015 is on track to see the most airline passengers ever. And this is partly due to the fact that Delta Airlines has come into the market, adding summer service to Sitka and Ketchikan, and year-round service to Juneau, and the ensuing fare wars that have really resulted in lucrative, nice, low fares, and lots of people really participating in that. Transportation costs have recently been identified as the #1 weakness to the Southeast Alaska regional economy. And so we know that increased transportation services and decreased costs will have a significant and positive impact on the Southeast Alaska economy if we can maintain these trends. So healthcare is also a really critical piece to the regional economy. When both private and local hospital care is taken into account, Southeast Alaska's healthcare workers earn 8% of all regional wages. Yet in a reversal of long-term trends and projections, we're actually down in terms of looking at healthcare industry numbers. Jobs have fallen by about 100 over the past 2 years, and this is in spite of the fact that health needs in the region are continuing to increase. The losses appear to be in response to higher costs in a regulatory environment that is increasingly complex and expensive. While Medicaid expansion is expected to have a positive impact on the regional healthcare employment levels, in the short term, healthcare industry jobs will continue to fall. And actually, if you look at the numbers out for 2015 so far, it looks like we're going to be down about another 100 jobs in 2015. Now onto construction, and we've had a long upward trend there, and that's really also starting to reverse as well. Construction employment fell by 100 jobs last year, and early employment data from 2015 indicate that construction employment will drop about another 100 jobs this year as well. Construction workers earned $150 million last year. That's 7% of all Southeast Alaska earnings. And over the last 5 years, what you've really seen is new homes and commercial buildings and high-profile publicly funded construction projects really causing a bit of a construction boom here in Southeast Alaska. Now, unfortunately, the contraction of the state budget, reduced federal spending, those things combined have really meant that future projects are no longer being added to the construction pipeline. And so while the existing backlog of projects funded by prior legislative appropriations, grants, or loans should reduce the rate of decline over the next couple of years, 2 to 3 years, as large-scale endeavors are unable to obtain funding, construction projects will likely be put on hold, and that sector will continue to decline. On the bright side, home building is up, with 321 new housing units being built or permitted across the region in 2014, and that's about twice what that was 5 years ago. On to mining. In 2014 and 2015, construction or mining operations employment was relatively flat, while exploration was on the decline. In 2014, there was nearly 800 mining jobs in Southeast Alaska with a payroll of $80 million. And jobs were actually up a hair thanks to a rally in zinc prices. With an average annual wage of $100,000, mining jobs pay the highest wages in the region, 2.5 times that of the average private sector wage. And despite decreasing metal prices, production has been up. If you look at the 2 operating mines in our region, Kennecott, Kensington, and Greens Creek, what you see is that at Kensington, production was up by 50% over the past 2 years, and Greens Creek's daily mill rate of 2,200 tons per day is the highest daily average value that you've seen since 1989, since operations began. After rising for 11 consecutive years, in 2013, the global commodity prices began to trend downward. And the decrease in gold prices is linked to the national recovery as investors move away from the so-called safe haven precious metal investments. And while the decrease in zinc and rare earth elements is due to decreasing demand in China, as the growth of that economy has really slowed substantially. And unfortunately, demand in China is expected to continue to decrease, which likely means that metal prices will continue downward trends, which means that we're really looking at an outlook of job losses in the mining industry for Southeast Alaska. So we've talked about the sectors that make up our larger economic pie, but there's some key elements that fall outside that carefully constructed pie, and I wanted to talk about a couple of them today. One is the Southeast Alaska arts economy. The artist economy can't really be measured by conventional means and sort of the data sets that you get from the Alaska Department of Labor. But through conducting a massive survey last year, we know that the arts economy is really a big deal here in Southeast Alaska. We have 2,340 full and part-time artists. A lot of those have other full-time jobs and do their art on the side. And when we look at the spending by artists and art organizations and then audiences, we see that the total spending of those 3 things last year measured about $60 million across the region. And relatively speaking, when you look at the US economy as a whole and the number of artists in the US economy, we actually have about 3 times as many artists here in Southeast Alaska, and again, relatively speaking, to the nation as a whole. Another element, and this is a really important element that falls outside of our pie, is the maritime sector, the maritime economy, because it really draws from all of our sectors. And this is our blue economy, and this is the area in which our jobs are really drawn directly out of our ocean. In Southeast Alaska, there's nearly 7,000 private and US Coast Guard blue jobs, as maritime jobs are sometimes called, with nearly $400 million in associated wages. The largest component of our maritime sector is the seafood industry, which accounted for about 2/3 of all maritime jobs last year. And in the past 5 years alone, we've added 900 maritime jobs to our economy, and total blue wages grew by $90 million. And that's really enormous and significant. And when you compare the maritime economy of Southeast Alaska to that of Alaska, in Southeast Alaska, our maritime wages make up about 1/4 of all private sector earnings. And if you look at the statewide maritime economy, it's about 11% of the total economy, and it totals about 29,000 jobs and $1.6 billion in annual workforce earnings. So it's a slightly smaller share of the total economy than it is in the Southeast. In Southeast, it's huge. It's one of our biggest drivers overall. And while we're talking about how so much of our commerce is connected to our ocean, it seemed a good time to talk about land ownership. So this is an infographic in which the size of the circle represents the size of acres of ownership. But I couldn't put all federal ownership into one bubble, or you wouldn't have been able to see any of the other circles. Southeast Alaska's land ownership is really dominated by the federal government, which manages 94% of the Southeast Alaska land base. That's enormous, 94%. And 78% of that is the Tongass National Forest. Alaska Native organizations, so this includes the village, urban, and regional corporations, and the Annette Island Reservation manage 3.4% of the land base. Coming in at number 3, big heavyweight state of Alaska has 2.5% of the land base that it manages. Our boroughs and communities own just 53,000 acres. That's 1/4% of all of our lands, and other private holdings count for 0.05% of the total land base. And you don't really see this type of ownership structure anywhere else in the United States. It's really completely unique to Southeast Alaska. You see some reflection of it on the federal level. So for example, statewide you have 65% of our lands are managed by the federal government. The state government has 24% of the lands across the state. Alaska Native organizations manage 10%. And municipal land ownership is actually pretty similar in terms of total percentage, while private land ownership is 0.7% of all Alaska acres, which seems tiny, but here in Southeast Alaska, we think that's huge. We would like some more of that. We would like to be up to 0.7%. Now, speaking of the Tongass, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, timber has greatly diminished in the region since 1991. However, I did want to highlight one of our few remaining mills in Southeast Alaska. On Prince of Wales, Viking Lumber is a local family-owned mill that produces 85% of all regional cut lumber. And I thought it would be really interesting just to find out what the wood in Southeast Alaska is used for. And Viking Lumber is actually the largest piano stock producer in the United States, which I was really surprised by. 40,000 pianos a year are made out of Sitka spruce into Steinway, Yamaha, and Kauai pianos. And actually, I think all Kauai pianos over the last 17, 18 years were made by Viking Lumber, made from Viking Lumber, from the lumber there. Other primary uses of Viking wood include sending spruce to be made into Japanese shoji screens. Their western red cedar is used primarily to make Cape Cod style home remodels, and their hemlock is made into panel doors and to window frames. We also wanted to share with you some top-line data from our 2015 Business Climate Survey. Last summer, 416 Southeast Alaska business owners and top managers from 29 communities across the region responded to our survey. The Southeast Conference Business Climate Survey takes the pulse of our local business community and economy, and it was completed in 2010 by the Juneau Economic Development Council. And so we were able to kind of look back and compare some of our findings to the findings that we had 5 years ago. And we started asking that where are we now question to our business leaders. We asked how they feel about the overall business climate in Southeast Alaska. And as we've discussed, the economy has really grown a lot over the past 5 years, and the responses really reflected that in the findings. So those who reported that the current state of our business climate is good or very good rose from just over half to 2/3, while those reporting that our economy was poor or very poor fell from 45% to 29% across responders. And actually, overall, this pie chart looks very similar to how it did 5 years ago. Industry leaders were asked to predict the economic future for their industry or business. So we didn't ask about the economic health of the region overall, just their industry or just their business. And 38% of them said they thought it would get better or much better. 1/5 thought they would get it, that their business or industry would, the tide would turn, it would become worse or much worse. But most of them said that they expected their business or industry just to remain going at the current state that it is now. And the only industry in which the majority of respondents said that we really think our businesses are going to get better or much better was the visitor industry, as you might expect. But notably pessimistic about the direction that their industries were headed were those involved with timber, construction, and healthcare. And because, as we've talked about, healthcare and construction together compose 15% of the regional economy overall, their concerns carry increased significance. The survey also asked questions about traditional barriers and benefits of business operations. The top benefit to operating a business in Southeast Alaska was identified as overall quality of life, followed by recreation, culture, and the arts. Now, this should tell you that we do not have a typical business climate here in Southeast Alaska. By and large, businesses aren't coming here to put their operations here because of our typical business climate and the typical business climate advantages. They're located here because of quality of life, access to the outdoors, and access to arts. And this really makes us unique in terms of an economy. Elements which business leaders were most likely to call barriers included the overall cost of business, with 82% of all business leaders surveyed calling business costs a moderate or significant barrier. And you can really see by these top responses what costs that they're really concerned about and having trouble and struggling with. First of all, the cost of moving freight and the cost of moving people, so the transportation costs, as we've discussed earlier, and also the cost of real estate and the cost of housing overall. And the next big barrier that people talked about was the ability to identify and find and hire a skilled professional workforce in Southeast Alaska. So so it's really costs and workforce end up being the two biggest barriers. Now what I wanted to do is summarize our upward projections, and unfortunately this year the list is pretty short. The visitor industry, as I think you can surmise from listening to this presentation, really has the strongest outlook of all Southeast Alaska industries. It tends to follow national and international trends, which are projected to grow about 4% annually through 2020. In conjunction with more visitors, the retail and wholesale trade is also expected to increase. And timber hasn't made this list in a long time, but after nearly losing the industry entirely, the Big Thorn sale and the Sea Alaska Land Exchange will bring that industry back from the brink, giving it an upward outlook for the first time in years. Now for the downward projections. Jobs in Southeast Alaska will be down by about 450 jobs in 2015. That's about 1%. Expect to see all sectors of the government continue to shed jobs, with about 200 fewer state jobs across the region. So that's about a quarter of all state jobs that are going to be lost in the state will come out of Southeast Alaska. Also expect healthcare and construction jobs to be down about 100 jobs each. The number of people, commercial fishermen, or at least I should say local commercial fishermen in Southeast Alaska, that number really doesn't change much from year to year. But as with harvest being below expectations and prices being down, the amount of money that seafood is going to bring into our economy is going to be less than expected, and seafood processing jobs will be down. Expect population and mining employment to both be down a hair. And again, the big story here is to see what will be decided on the state level and how the ramifications of those decisions are going to trickle down into every element of our economy, including, for example, like the ferry system, which Southeast Conference fought so hard to start in the first place. Alaska employment as a whole, I want to talk a little bit about Alaska projections as well, is expected to be relatively flat in 2015, with a little bit of upward movement of less than 0.5% in terms of jobs. Like Southeast Alaska, tourism will be up, and retail and accommodation jobs are expected to be up by about 2,100 jobs in 2015. And that's an increase of 9% in the accommodation sector, so that's huge. Unlike Southeast Alaska, the building boom in the state as a whole is still alive and well. And so you can expect about 1,000 new construction jobs to pop up in Alaska as a whole in 2015. Job losses will include seafood processing. That's going to be a 9% decrease there. And that, along with professional business services, each of those sectors is going to drop about 1,100 jobs across the state this year. State government jobs will be down about 700 jobs in 2015, and mining jobs will be down about 360 jobs. These are the projections for 2015. So what can you do with all this information? Well, there's numerous applications, I hope, but one way to incorporate these findings is into long-term economic planning. Southeast Conference is about halfway through the Southeast Alaska 2020 economic planning process. Through 18 workshops and strategic planning meetings with the input of about 215 people, Southeast Conference membership has developed 6 goals and 60 objectives across 9 different sectors. And they're at the stage in the process where they're looking at input. So if you've listened to this presentation, you've got ideas for how to improve and fix Southeast Alaska, you can check out that discussion on the Southeast Conference homepage at seconference.org and provide your input there. So I really want to thank 360 North for hosting this forum tonight. This was Southeast Conference's economic report to the region. Shelley Wright, the executive director of Southeast Conference, is here with me. Again, I'm Meilani Schijvens from Raincoast Data. And with that, I think we'd love to answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you so much.
So now it's time, as Meilani said, for the question portion of the forum. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please walk up to the microphone so everyone can hear it. Please go ahead.
Meilani, thank you.
Thank you.
2 questions. You had several slides on marine employment. Did that
Yes.
include the Alaska Marine Highway System? It wasn't explicit.
Okay.
And secondly, who's tracking the attractiveness of Southeast to migrants, especially old folks like us, and those who will be escaping sea level rise over the next several decades? Are we a logical destination for those folks, bringing their income with them, not necessarily needing jobs here? Who's tracking that?
Okay,
Thanks.
so the first question is actually a really good one. You wanted to know whether the maritime economy slide that we showed earlier was just private jobs or if it included public jobs like the AMHS. So the first time that we did this analysis, we did a really big analysis that included all private sector and public sector jobs. So it included fish and game, it included the marine highway system. And when you look at the Southeast Alaska economy as a whole, 1/4 of all earnings across the region were maritime earnings. But unfortunately, that was really hard to track because we had to separate the fish from the game, of fish and game, and how do you do that? You know, different analysts would do that in a different way, so we didn't have access to a steady stream of data where we could equally compare that year after year. So what we did after that is we just looked at the private sector and included Coast Guard in with that because it's such a big deal, and we're able to track that growth on an annual level. And so when you look at that, it's actually also just about the same 24% of our total economy. So the answer is yes and yes. It's 24% when you're just looking at the private sector, and it's also 24% when you're, or 24 or 25% when you're looking at all of Southeast Alaska, including AMHS jobs. And then the second question about how do we rate the attractiveness of the region, or how do we measure that? That's obviously really hard to do, and we tried to get at that with our business climate survey. And I think you really saw that Southeast Alaska, it's really an attractive place to live. That's why businesses are coming here. That's why people are putting their businesses here. But I see what you're saying. You're saying not just businesses, but just individuals. And one thing I think we could do a much better job of is marketing our region. We know that the quality of life is really high here in Southeast Alaska. So how do we get that message out? And I think that's something that we could do. I think it's a place where a lot of people really would like to live for those things that we talked about: quality of life, access to recreation, access to arts, access to the great people that we have here.
Yeah, my question has to do with, you had a chart on there that was a poll of business owners, and only about 19% of them thought that their businesses would be worse or much worse in the coming year or years.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to the accuracy of that, either past polls you've taken, if those have been accurate, or if you feel like this is particularly accurate, because it didn't seem to jive with the rest of the information that you had there.
Right, and so there's a couple of reasons for that. One. So what we did is we tried to do a lot of outreach. It wasn't a scientific poll. It was people who wanted to answer our survey. But we worked really hard to do the outreach, and we got about 416 business owners from across the region to answer. I didn't normalize it for how many were involved in the visitor industry who answered, so I I included all findings in there. It was really interesting. I thought that it looked really similar to 5 years ago. And remember that we're asking people specifically about their business or their industry. And right now there's a lot of economic uncertainty moving forward. But if you're looking at your own business and you're saying, how am I doing? You can really only base that on how many customers you have lined up now, what your past trends have been, where it appears to be going. Right now, we don't really know what's going to happen at the statewide level and how those decisions are going to affect my specific business, his specific business. So I think that business owners are saying, well, if I just look at what I know now, my business or industry is actually going quite well. And so so I'll report on those findings. And I think we did have a lot of respondents from the visitor industry that might have tracked that number up a little bit.
There's proposed cuts to the ferry system in Southeast.
Yes.
What do you think the economic impacts will be?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's really hard to measure because the ferry system, it really does so much for the Southeast Alaska economy. On one hand, it's bringing visitors into Southeast Alaska, but on the other hand, it's providing really essential and key services to local communities. It is the transportation sector for Southeast Alaska. And, every time we poll the region and we say, what are your concerns about the region? They say that access to transportation is the #1 economic concern when you look at Southeast Alaska as a whole. And really the heart of the transportation provider is AMHS, is our ferry system. And, we look at a Juneau, we have daily jets that are coming in here. But when you look at smaller communities that really depend on ferry service, the economic impact of that decline or perhaps those losses, I mean, that could be really huge. And we don't have an actual study that we can point to saying, this is the economic impact on Cake, this is the economic impact on Anangoon. But it's what we do know is that it really is it's going to be big. It's going to be a big deal. Any cuts to transportation in the region is huge. If you do any analysis, the one thing that jumps out right away is how critical transportation linkages are to having an operating and healthy economy here.
You talk about the different economies. You have tourism, you have fishing and the likes there.
Yeah.
How much of that is seasonal employment? What part of that seasonal employment of most of the industries in Southeast Alaska leave Southeast with those dollars? I know years ago McDowell Group did a survey up in Skagway, and they noted that close to 90% of the money generated during the tourism industry was taken out of that community when the season stopped. So,
Right.
Just curious about how much of that value is actually leaving the state.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's one of the reasons I don't. As you've seen, I've been mostly focusing on wages rather than jobs, because if you look at the spike of jobs in the summer, you look at tourism jobs in the middle of summer as a single point of data. You look at seafood jobs in the middle of the summer as a single point of data. I mean, those numbers are really high. And so when we're looking at the seafood industry, actually, we're only including commercial fishermen that are local, that are based year-round in Southeast Alaska. So those dollars are staying here. We're not including people who are commercial fishing who are coming from outside of the states or outside of Southeast Alaska. And so we're really looking at trying to figure out the larger impact of those dollars. Obviously, we can kind of there's reports you can look through the different sectors and see which percentage of the jobs in each industry are locally based. But we kind of do our best to look at the average annual job and not look at those high spikes, because I agree that would really throw off our perception of the economy as a whole.
So basically, what we have is resources that are being depleted and revenues that are disappearing and going to the lower 48. So all the resources and revenues are benefiting the lower 48. They're not benefiting our state. They're not benefiting the people. So it's like a a sponge. If you spill some water on the table, you get a sponge and put it on top of that. You lift it up and squeeze it, and everything goes to lower 48. So how do you change that? Or are there any possible ways that you can think of where we could change that, where it could benefit the people, where the people could get more revenues and benefit from the resources?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, because when you look at the sort of economic history of Alaska and Southeast Alaska, it was really set up in order to benefit corporations and people who were living down south in the lower 48. And so we sort of set up this original economic model like in the 1880s, 1890s. And so changing that has taken, it's going to take a lot of time. And obviously we get a lot more economic benefit to the region now, that a lot more money is staying here than it was 100 years ago. But I think we need to continue to work on having more production in the region. We have a great situation with the Ketchikan shipyard actually building ferries in Alaska, by Alaska, for the Alaska Marine Highway System for the first time ever. Having more production in the region, letting people know how much art we have here, looking at exporting more of the things that we're actually making here and producing here. And that's really the way to do that, to keep more value in the region.
If there are any more questions, please feel free to go up to the mic. I have one. How do Alaska Native organizations and corporations fit into this economic picture?
Well, that's a really great question, because we talked about the art and we talked about maritime, and so we talked about two sort of sectors that fall out of that economic pie because they don't fit nicely in it. And the economic importance of Southeast Alaska-based Native organizations is clearly significant. We have Sea-Alaska, Central Council, local tribal organizations, Search, the Heritage Institute, and not just employment dollars, but also in the benefits that they're giving to the people across the region, the services that they're providing, and also the dividends. I think we just saw that Sea-Alaska just paid out $17.5 million in dividends across the region. And I know that not all of those shareholders are actually living in Southeast Alaska right now, but you can look and say, well, that's actually equivalent to all the wages paid in the timber industry this year, is equivalent to the impact of that dividend. So not all of that, that's an analysis that needs to be done. It hasn't been done yet. I would love to see it. I would love to do it, but it is really important, and I'm really glad you mentioned that.
If there are no more questions, I was hoping, is Shelley Wright in the audience? I was just hoping if you can just comment a little bit about who is this report for, and kind of what's the purpose? Why do you guys do this every year?
Hello. As Executive Director of Southeast Conference, this report is put together for our members and for all of the people in Southeast Alaska. And its purpose is to give people a snapshot of where the region is going. Businesses can use it to plan their next year's efforts. Their transportation companies can use it to figure out where the pitfalls are. There's a lot of information in this report that people use for future planning. We mentioned our 2020 plan. Within our every 5 years we put a plan together, and we use this to move forward with our next objectives for the following year. And folks within the region and businesses within the region could do the same thing.
Did you want to add anything to that, Meilani, or?
I think it's really gratifying to watch. We put this together originally 4 years ago, so this is the fourth rendition of it. And it's really been gratifying to watch and to see how many different organizations are citing Southeast Alaska by the numbers as they're putting together different business plans, different business models, reports to the government. The governor and different lawmakers are citing these numbers. And being able to have this really short, digestible publication. The publication itself it's 12 pages. I think we have a copy of for you guys here tonight. It's also on the Southeast Conference website. But we try to put together short, digestible, easy to read information to get everyone on the same page. And that's really the point of it, to give people easy access to the data that really defines our region and is so important for making any decisions moving forward.
Well, that's all the time we have today for Forum at 360, Southeast Alaska by the Numbers. Audience, please help me in thanking Meilani Schijvens.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for being here.
Funding for Forum at 360 comes from Rainbow Foods of Juneau.